Okay? And so what I want to share with you guys, we're going to look at a couple of clips in a documentary that's based on the Gang of 19. Have you guys heard of them? Yeah? So by show of hands, who has? Got a few people. Anybody want to share what they know about them? Did you want to share, Ashley? Go for it.
The Gang of 19 is basically about people who are disabled, and they came together to make a change because the local bus system at the time wouldn't allow people in wheelchairs to ride them.
Yeah.
So the Gang of 19, for people in wheelchairs, they they all got together and they made a change.
Yeah, absolutely. They made a change. Thank you for sharing that, Ashley. Yes. Hey, woo! Absolutely. Right? I love it. They realized that, listen, this is wrong. And we have to do something about it, right? They stepped into their power. Not only did they own their story, they owned the struggles, right? But then they were able to see, you know what, it doesn't have to be this way. And we're gonna step into that power. So we're gonna watch a couple of clips and then we're gonna talk about this a little bit, okay? All right.
This was like a silent revolution.
Colorado is so often really at the center of national trends.
Colorado was the center of the disability rights movement in the 1970s and 80s. With the founding of ADAPT, a new era of activism among people with disabilities.
It became a national movement. Its heartbeat was coming from Denver.
Armed with the promise of equal access and the right leadership at the right time, 19 brave individuals inspired the nation. It was a long and challenging battle, blessed with the perfect mix of civil disobedience, the lens of the media, legal action, and passionate individuals whose lives depended on it.
The Gang of 19 are a group of young people that grew up in a Denver nursing home.
The protests in Denver were the beginning of a new era.
Denver became one of the first cities to have accessible mass transit.
And I don't know of any movement that was so insistent on winning.
Having their rights acknowledged and their abilities, rather than just their disability, was very important.
And so the ADA was passed to end a protest that began with the Gang of 19.
This program was generously made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
With support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media. With additional support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you. Thank you.
Humanity has always had, either by birth or accident, individuals that live with disabilities. Today in the United States, their rights are legally assured, but that was not always the case. Over 15 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act passed at the federal level in 1990, activists in Colorado were fighting for social change. Fueled by the civil rights movements that were sweeping the nation, Denver became ground zero.
44 million Americans at that time were disabled. You can't not know somebody who's disabled.
And so the activism of the 1970s in Denver has many dimensions, including very material change about the conditions under which people live, but also just a kind of good morning wake-up call to say this is a very big subject, and to every person to remember disability is not something that happens to other people. It happens to everyone in the aging process. We are all in the category of the temporarily able-bodied.
The beginnings of the disability rights movement really takes place after World War II and reaches a peak in the 1970s and 80s. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is just a little over 25 years old now.
And so there were important leaders doing important things everywhere. But the impulse for the movement, at least through the ADA, came through Atlantis Adapt.
For hundreds, if not thousands of years, people with disabilities were the objects of pity and derision, of discrimination. They were institutionalized, they were marginalized, they were segregated, they were treated as abnormal, they were put on exhibit in circuses and freak shows. People with disabilities in many cases were not considered human beings.
This is a cold and grim way of putting it, but it was sort of storage. We'll just store them. And if it requires sedation, if it requires confinement, that's what we'll do.
Before the ADA, people with disabilities would have been more isolated, not being able to have a job, not because they couldn't, but simply because society looked at it as someone with a disability couldn't work. They wouldn't have been able to go to school, or they would have had to go to a segregated special school.
The whole structure of healthcare has always been nationally funded. You couldn't go anywhere, you couldn't do anything. You were literally stuck because you couldn't move.
And before our movement began, you are guaranteed a nursing home bed to rot and die. You are not promised the right to home and community-based services and being able to live in those freedoms that we talk about. Just because you are born with or you acquire a disability, that doesn't give them a right to say, oh, we'll lock you up in a nursing home.
They would have been forced to live in institutions, particularly children who were born with a disability. Parents were encouraged at birth to send their children to institutions.
It was a very structured environment with lots of regulations to control the activity, control the behavior of the residents, of what they would have called the inmates at the time, because there wasn't a lot of difference between institutionalized homes for the disabled and prisons in many respects.
Or they would have been overly medicated, what's often called chemical restraints.
Haldol that was used to snow people and to keep them, snowing is the term that we use, to make people groggy and not alert. And snowing was the soup du jour for how to care for people, not just for agitation or behaviors, but as a way of tamping down the need to require anything or complain.
Roosevelt was elected in 1932. It tells you a lot about our attitudes towards people with disabilities that the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, who had a disability, also tried to hide that disability from most Americans because he knew that even though he was a role model for others, being confined to a wheelchair was in his time a stigma. It was a confinement in a way that the Gang of 19 completely rejected.
And transportation at that time was extremely primitive. There was one or two private companies that provided wheelchair accessible transportation. They charged $35 for a ride, it doesn't matter, to and from. And at that time, if you were in a nursing home, the state gave you $10 a month in personal needs. So transportation became a big issue. People could not get on a bus, obviously. It was not wheelchair accessible, let alone getting into, a building, restaurant, and the like. So it was difficult. Children with disabilities were not guaranteed a free, appropriate education until 1973.
Actually, I'm old enough that I can tell you what it was like.
As of the tender age of 3, Dawn Russell spent a decade living in and out of Crippled Children's Hospital, a youth nursing home in Tennessee. Her actively engaged parents visited every time they were allowed, Thursdays and Sundays from 2 to 4 p.m.
The school that I went to wasn't accessible. The elementary wasn't accessible, so I was literally carried in to my school every day. It was absolutely growth stunning. I have cerebral palsy, and so without accommodations, without being able to get into the school, having to be carried into a classroom every day. Growing up and learning and all of those things are complicated. You have the other kids that you're contending with, and before I met ADAPT, I thought there were two types of people with disabilities, and I didn't want to be either one. The two types are super gimps and invalids. My whole life, I kept saying, I don't fit in that world. When I imagined my life, it had everything in it that everyone else does. Education, love, a home, a family. I may have been discriminated against, but I didn't sit there and take it. I fought it.
There were a bunch of young people housed in a nursing home called Heritage House, and it was a hellhole. Like, one person was amputated from repeated untreated bed sores at above the waist and was described as the shortest person in Colorado.
The reported neglect included residents with maggots in their wounds and flies on their face.
Cockroaches in cereal, people who were neglected, people who were abandoned by their families to institutions because of a variety of care reasons or the difficulty of caring for them in a non-accessible social order. Wade Blank came and was made the activities director.
Wade Blank was raised in Ohio, and over time in the 1960s he became a Presbyterian minister. He was a civil rights activist. He marched with Martin Luther King at Selma.
That was a major part of his story, and he was thoroughly trained in nonviolent civil disobedience.
He helped draft resistors during the Vietnam era. He was a man who believed in social justice.
He'd been a minister when Kent State people got murdered, and he had left Kent State after the killings and was basically horrified and not well emotionally. And he just needed to get out of everything. So he came here and he took this job as the activities director at Heritage House. It turned out that he led a movement out of there.
And in 1971, Heritage House was really organized along the lines of other disability institutions at that time. As Wade Blank pointed out, they were joyless places.
And my wife, then wife, said, there's this guy that works here, you'd really like him. We both had a background in civil rights. We hit it off. We became very close friends, and eventually Wade wanted me to work with him. And I realized the day I started that no one in this wing, and it accommodated about 60 people, really wanted to be there, but there weren't the community-based services.
At Heritage House, Wade Blank was placed in charge of youth services, and so he was catering to the needs of teenagers and people in their early 20s. Youth culture was really flourishing in the 1970s, and so the young people who lived at Heritage House wanted the same kinds of social activities and leisure activities that young people all over the country wanted. And Wade Blank did what he could to accommodate them. He would arrange for buses to take them to rock concerts. He allowed pets. He allowed all kinds of socialization, posters, anything for young people to express who they were as individuals.
It was 1974. We were pushing for more, quote, normalization. We had wine with meals for those that were of age. We oftentimes got pizzas. I don't know how we did it, but there were dogs. A lot of the people living there wanted dogs, and we were able to get them. We never let the health department know. It was very cool. Field trips left and right. We were involved with registering everyone to vote. We had some political candidates coming to the nursing home. Dick Lamb, Gary Hart, Tim Worth. I was in my late 20s. Wade was in his early 30s. We were getting a lot of pressure from the nursing home because we were pushing for more rights, that people should have a choice in who their attendant should be. Nurses were barging into rooms, when they should knock first. But he says, I think we need to get people out, and I have this idea, and I think it should be called Atlantis.
What you got, Corey?
I like sad.
Sad? Yeah. Why sad, though? Why are you guys depressed? Why are you sad?
Because people have problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. What you got, Michael?
Well, I think it's kind of sad how I get to hear about the disabilities, making fun of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And stuff like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of crazy that we had a president that had a disability, and he couldn't even, be the role model that he wanted to be, right? Because of the stigma that came with it. What do you guys want to do about that?
Make a change.
What kind of change?
Or if you had another president that was in a wheelchair, that they could, make the desk, I don't know, just like workable.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that his office would be workable, accessible. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? What you got, Jared?
Yeah, I can't believe that actually happened.
Yeah? Which part?
Family being abandoned by their family, but my parents would never do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I completely understand that. The reality is unfortunately some families didn't really have a choice. There was a point in time in history where if you didn't have the money to be able to take care of your family members, if they had a disability, then you would put them into a nursing home. And very similarly to the way that a lot of students are segregated in schools, they were segregated in these nursing homes. And they just didn't have the ability outside of that to take care of their families because nothing was accessible. Does that make sense, Jared?
Yeah.
So sometimes money plays a huge factor, sometimes time plays a huge factor, when all of your family members are working every single day, and then nothing around you is accessible. It makes it really, really difficult. And so they tried to use something that was there that was supposed to help. And ultimately it ended up hurting them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to share? What you got, Mia?
I do feel sad about this.
Yeah.
But if this come out to the white way to do it is to government or something, like we did with a situation, right?
Right.
Let's do something about them and do something with them with that.
Absolutely. So you're saying that you would like to do something about it, right? Yeah. Right? So, I mean, thank you. Thinking, especially just going back to what Jared was saying, this shouldn't be allowed to happen, especially in institutions and spaces that are supposed to be helping human beings, right? And so when we recognize that these things are happening, that this discrimination is allowed to take place, that this dehumanization is allowed to take place, the question a lot of times tends to, or the burden a lot of times tends to fall on the family. But we have to realize that there's actually a huge flaw in the system itself that designed a world that made this okay in the first place. And we have to address that. That's when we think about root causes, right? The family itself is also suffering. But we have to think about the root cause. What actually created a world that made this okay? Because it's not. So what can we do about it? And so I'm going to show you in the next part of the video what this group decided to do about it. Cool?
Cool.
All right.